Hey Tarot people, it is Tarot Tuesdays again. My name is Shannon Douglas, and today I'm going to be talking about the Justice card and building on last week's episode where we talked about the swap in position that happened for Justice and the Strength card, the number 8 in the deck with the Rider-Waite iteration of Tarot about 100 years ago. And because the two were swapped, I'm addressing them in the position 8 following the Chariot card to give them some context, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit in their relationship to the Chariot, but I'm also going to talk about them a little later in relation to the Wheel of Fortune. So I'm going to talk about 3 ways to interpret the Justice card to add insight to your reflections and readings in tarot as you're studying. And I want to take a minute to say thank you for my recent subscribers. I'm actively growing my channel, and I really appreciate the subscriptions, and it tells me that you're enjoying the content, that you would subscribe and get notifications that new content is going up. A side note, I launched a second series this week on my channel that is called Soul Mapping. And I'm taking a bit broader view on the tarot because there are many other traditions and tools like the tarot that we have accessible to us that give us a map of the psyche and the soul. And so I'm broadening my scope away from tarot a little bit so that I can cover some larger ground. As you probably know, I'm covering a much deeper exploration of the major arcana in these weekly Tarot Tuesdays videos. And today we're going to tackle Justice. So what's the concept of Justice? The card itself gives us an image of the woman, the Lady Justice, and her scales. In tarot, she is between, I'm just going to pull it up here so you can have a look. There she is. Lady Justice is sitting on the throne with her scales and her sword. Sword is enforcement of justice. She's between the two pillars, Boaz and Joaquin, and basically guarding the pathway to the holiest of holies. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we know that Thoth is the psychopomp. That means he's the conveyor of souls to the afterlife, the duat, where if you're traveling there, I mentioned this before, Thoth will escort you. You'll have your heart removed. Your heart is placed on one side of the scales and an ostrich feather on the other side of the scales, and that determines whether you remain in the duat or go on to a higher existence. And so Lady Justice is the guardian to that. She's the threshold guardian to a higher plane of existence. Now, early justice, this is the first type of justice that I want to explore with you or share with you, and that is about, well, first of all of justice is about maintaining the social order, and a crime is a betrayal of that social order. So the first, or the origin of justice as we understand it, is tribal order. And we go back, of course, many thousands of years to early human society. And there's actually a great book that I read a couple of years ago called The World Until Yesterday, What We Can Learn from Primitive Societies. It's by Jared Diamond, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he has spent much of his life in communication and moving in and out of traditional indigenous societies around the world, and wrote about some of their approaches to justice in a pre-framework or a framework of social order prior to the rule of law. So the first concept of justice is punishment is proportional to the crime. And we get the eye for an eye model of justice that goes back into the Old Testament kind of biblical tradition. There's an expression that we have now, an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. And nevertheless, that was our first formalized set of or type of justice that we had in society. The earliest code that we have or set of laws is the Hammurabi Code. That's from 1750 BC. And there were several hundred prescriptive justice implications. What I mean by that is, if you accidentally killed your neighbor's goat, there was a formula for the outcome or the punishment, the price to be paid. If somebody was killed, depending on what caste you were in or what level of the social order you were in, there was different types of justice, and it was a fairly complicated, long list. And imagine it would take the tribal leader or the king or whatever emperor would take quite some time to administer that type of justice. They say that the oldest profession is prostitution, but this was the birth of lawyers. Now, another one that's contemporary of that, perhaps, actually we think it's a little bit later from archaeology and biblical history, the Ten Commandments, of course, and the Book of Law, the Torah. And that type of justice, that tribal justice, is problematic. It's tribal. It can be authoritarian. It can be enforced as a matter of politics or not enforced as a matter of politics. So it's ripe for corruption. We get mob justice and jungle justice and honor code justice. Now, honor code justice is kind of interesting because it has to do with the warrior code, and this ties to the strength card. As a warrior in a warrior class or a warrior society, even in modern military, if a member of your group, your platoon or your fighting group fails in their capacity to honor and be trustworthy amongst the other warriors of the group, they represent a potential threat to the lives of the brothers. And so a type of justice that gets meted out is it's known as fragging. It is a crime from the larger perspective of military code, but when somebody is negligent and puts lives on the line within a fighting unit or within a society, then in order to protect society or protect the cohesion of the group, or the community, or the fighting unit, justice is meted out, and that type of justice is typically capital. Now, around we're going to get into the Hellenistic philosophers, right? So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and a number of other philosophers of that age, as well in the East at the time. In China, there was similar codes of conduct coming up. The ideas of a higher order of justice and around virtue and morality. So we went from an external enforcement, here's a set of rules outside of us, to taking inwards some of these notions of what justice is. And we get the cardinal virtues from Greece, as I mentioned before: strength, virtue, temperance, and wisdom. Now, around that time, or actually a couple of centuries later, we start to see some of the first great empires in the West, and we all are familiar perhaps with Alexander the Great. He was a student of Aristotle, and he conquered the known world, and it was it's legend how fast he actually conquered the known world, and he did that through a couple of means. One was he wasn't going to take anybody's culture and religion away, and lots of the peoples that he conquered actually just surrendered. And there wasn't much of a fight. He had an organized force, and he was going going east towards India, and many people just agreed that they would allow him to rule them because in exchange he provided justice. He provided a militia or a military force or a de facto police force, and enforced the peace along the trading routes under the empire. So we get the first police warrior state, and this was actually a higher order of enforcement of justice. Now, in India, 500 BC, we get the Buddha, and we had a number of other teachers of that age, and the notion of we went from eye for an eye that leaves everybody blind to treat others as you would like to be treated, the golden rule. Now, that golden rule I'm gonna tackle in depth in one of my soul mapping videos coming up, because I just find it it's like entering a hall of mirrors when you start to play around with this idea. But nevertheless, people like Jesus, the Buddha, Ashoka was a not a contemporary of Alexander the Great. He was an Indian emperor, a generation after Alexander the Great. He established the Edicts of Ashoka, which were stone cairns or pillars established at crossroads all over the empire, outlining rules of behavior that were more in line with Buddhist philosophy around compassion and the golden rule and things like that. So this brought us to another state or another stage of civilization where justice started to make a transformation into an internal. We started to internalize. So we've got an external police force, but we started to internalize the notion of code of conduct, of law, and of morality. And one of the ways that that was conceptualized was that we're going to behave well now, and that's going to be in exchange for a reward in the future. So, tribal justice is vicious. It's brutal. It's instant. Same with that sort of military fragging kind of justice I mentioned. But this other form of justice is an internalized moral or set of virtues that we have, and where we internalize the enforcement mechanisms and we police ourselves. Now, come along to I think it's the beginning of the 1200s, so the beginning of the 13th century in Europe, we get the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta is the beginning of enlightened justice. This is the third type of justice in the thing I said I was going to talk about, and that is to protect the individual from arbitrary abuse of power, and created a framework so that justice ceased to be arbitrary or ceased to be susceptible to arbitrary enforcement from tyrannical governance or lords or kings or emperors. And this began to frame what we now call the rule of law. And a big part of that Magna Carta was the notion of a trial by jury or trial by your peers, that we're innocent until we're proven guilty. And this is deeply, deeply tied to the concept of liberty and freedom. Now, it's not the concept of liberty and freedom that I mean, this is such a packed word, right? And it gets used in all kinds of ways these days. But liberty and freedom in this context really means that we're freedom from arbitrary tyranny and oppression by people who hold power. And so that was a big transformation in the rights of the individual and the rights of the individual to be protected from the state or from tyrannical power. Now, here's a little bonus. This is a type of justice that ties to that internal state. It's cosmic justice or natural law. And this is a deferring justice into the future. We have the concept of heaven. We have the concept of the duat, the Egyptian, as I was telling you. And this ties into internal integrity, internal morality, a sense of right conduct and fairness. Now, in the modern world, we're getting the word justice connected to a whole other concept. And that concept is social justice. And underneath social justice is the notion of equity as opposed to equality. Now, the Magna Carta was about the equality of people. The American Constitution was about the equality of people in principle, right? Like, we know that where it said all men are created equal, they were actually referring to men. And more specifically, at the time, they were referring to white men. And nevertheless, this aspirational concept at the beginning or early in the Enlightenment period, the Western Enlightenment, evolved to include the equality for all people, regardless of gender, regardless of race, and what our background is, and our station in life. This concept of equity, though, is very, very different. It is tied almost to the concept of equity is actually very closely tied to communism and Marxism. So communism is a fundamental ability or a fundamental idea about a utopian society where everyone has access to the same resources, food, clothing, shelter, and everyone lives in this utopian society ruled by some sort of benevolent leader or a philosopher king. And we've well proven that this kind of justice, this equity, doesn't work because human beings are just too corruptible. And there's all kinds of talk about rights these days with respect to justice. and rights to equity, but very, very little talk about responsibility. So justice in the scales has two components. It has our rights, which we internalize and we have to uphold, and we have our responsibilities to society at large to help to maintain the cohesion and coherence of society. And when things start to get unfair, and justice starts to become corrupt, or a sense of justice is undermined and becomes corrupt, then society starts to break down. So again, sort of a final thing here as we're approaching. By the way, try to cover an awful lot of ground here. You're probably not going to go to this kind of depth in a reading, but at least you have 2 or 3 different angles that you may allow your intuition to reveal if justice is coming up in a significant position in a reading that you're doing. What are your thoughts on this? I'm really curious about your interpretations, your experience of the ideas of justice, if you've got something to add here. I love it if you give me some feedback in the comments. One last thing I'll add about fairness. And all human beings have a sense of fairness. And it's not just human beings. There's a video I'm going to pin here, if I can, and maybe I'll try and clip it. There's a video of some monkeys in a lab. There's 2 monkeys that are in cages side by side. And one monkey, a lab worker, feeds a monkey a green grape. And he gives the other monkey a carrot, a piece of carrot. And the first monkey enjoys the green grape, and then he gets another green grape, and the second monkey, and you can see the expression on the face of this animal when he gets another carrot stick. And the monkey who is being arbitrarily treated unfairly or isn't getting what he wants kind of freaks out about this. So this notion of fairness goes really, really deep in our culture, in our biology, because if we're descended from, if we're evolved from an earlier primate, it means that much deeper layers in our biological scaffolding, we have this notion of what fairness is, and it leads us to all kinds of questions about the world that we live in, and perhaps we're at a stage where, just like the Hammurabi Code, getting past the jungle justice and pure eye for an eye, and as we evolved and brought in the golden rule and love thy neighbor and the sense of compassion, and then structured justice where we have a police force or a justice enforced by some sort of militia within society to maintain social order. And then the notion of fairness to individuals from arbitrary and punitive attacks in the Magna Carta, and the rights to a trial and the presumption of innocence. And then enlightened justice, where we have the rule of law. Perhaps in the near future will evolve a truly functional higher order of justice, or iterated notion of what justice is in the world, and have the capacity to administer it. I am really afraid that social justice is not the methodology for that to take place, for a bunch of reasons, and that puts me in a position where I've been canceled 3 times in the last month in various forums and groups because I disagree philosophically with the notions of pure equity, social equity, and equity over equality. The reason that I believe that I disagree with that is that I think that we all have the ability to work for an outcome, and that there's a few people within the society that are driven, that are motivated, they're inventors, they're creative, they're business people, they're leaders. It's part of their natural tendency, and there's a significant portion of society that doesn't share those traits. And if we de-incentivize leadership, innovation, creativity, and the evolution of our society from thinkers and leaders, and take that away from them, then we actually end up descending into chaos from order. So my name is Shannon Douglas. This has been a long one for Tarot Tuesdays, talking about justice. And next week I'm going to talk about the Hermit card, which is another deep one. As we go along in tarot and through the major arcana, we're moving away from the kind of specific and fairly easy to articulate things about masculine, feminine archetypes and the structure of the psyche in the Lover's card and internal parts with the Chariot, and we get into these abstract things like what is justice and what are the impacts of these sorts of things. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time. I hope you enjoy, and if you like it and you're part of a tarot community, let people know, point them to the videos, and I'll soon be able to take questions once I get through the major arcana. We got another few weeks to go, but I'd love to get your feedback and questions and responses.